further if anything else is going to happen with anything recorded. With that said, I think I can hand over to Imre Galambos. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Imre Galambos. I'm a professor of Chinese at the Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies. And I'm very happy to welcome you all here for this conference, workshop. The idea came from my final year PhD student, Prof. Citta-cetasika. He works on meditative and visualization techniques in Dunhuang manuscripts, actually in a specific Dunhuang manuscript. And he had this idea about probably 4 or 5 years ago to do a small workshop involving maybe just a few people, like 8 or 9 people, and to do some very concentrated study of these techniques, and something that would help him with his research as well. And so we organized that, and then the pandemic hit, and so we couldn't carry it out. And then 3 years passed, or maybe more. And as we started getting out of the pandemic, the workshop grew in size, and eventually we opened it up to the public online, and then more and more people registered. And I think there were about 240 people registered online. And we're also very glad to see a number of distinguished scholars and researchers to be with us here in person. So also from the UK, from various other universities, including Oxford and Cambridge, but also elsewhere, and also from Europe, Germany, and other places, and from overseas, not the least from Japan. And so this started out as a smaller thing, but actually eventually grew to something bigger. And that's maybe one aspect in which the pandemic was very useful for us, that we started to think not just in physical terms, but quite fittingly for the subject of this conference in sort of supra-physical or hyper-physical ways. And now we can also have a number of people visiting us or joining us, not in physical presence, but through Zoom, basically. So it can be much bigger. Everything that's happening here has been made possible by our sponsors. So the event is actually hosted by the Faculty of East Asian Studies and also the Faculty of Divinity. These two faculties are very close to each other, just a few hundred meters away. And they are physically here in Cambridge hosting this organization. And so we have people from our faculty, from East Asian Studies side, and also from Divinity. Chris Johns, who just heard, he's based in Divinity here. But we also have financial sponsors, and these are the Glorison Foundation, who've been very, very generous with us over the past 6-7 years. And they've donated lots of resources enabling the study of Buddhism, largely Chinese Buddhism, but any other sort of Buddhism here at Cambridge. And also the DIRI, so the Dharma Chai, the 60th Dharma Chai Educational Foundation. So they all are the sponsors who make this possible. So please welcome them. We also have obviously personnel here. So here you see almost Dr. Dunfu Wong, who's filing his dissertation in 2 months probably, and he's going to help you here. So if you have any questions, please ask him. He should be able to help. And so with that, I don't want to take up your time. So let's begin this conference. Welcome everyone, and I hope you have a good time. To everyone online as well, the same. Thank you. Yeah. And hello again, I'm stepping in. Yes, I'm not Sarah Shaw, who hasn't yet arrived, but she's coming as we speak. But I'll step in as the temporary host, not host, but chair for this panel. And so the first presenter is Professor Kate Crosby, who is the Nimitta Professor of Buddhist Studies at Oxford, and who specializes in Sanskrit, Pali, and Pali vernacular literature, and the Theravada practice in pre-modern and modern periods. And I'm not going to read this whole thing because I want to give her time to present her own presentation. So please welcome Professor Crosby.
Thank you very much. Welcome, and welcome also to the Vidyadharas and Darkinis online. I'm just beginning to get used to this idea of more people online than present, so it's a new form. So so I'm going to end up talking about visual experience and the body in pre-modern meditation manuals in Sri Lanka, but I have a few preliminaries, which I agreed with Venerable Kitipanyo before, since I'm the first speaker. So how do I change the slide? There we go. Wonderful. So first a bit on terminology. So I'm really delighted that Venerable Kitipanyo managed to come up with a very simple term for us, the visual experience term in the title of the conference, because we have been struggling, and you can see this in the writing. So mostly people have used the term visualization, and the problem with that, of course, is that it's indicative of active creation. And the source of that is usually internal. It's something we generate ourselves. Sometimes we see in the literature the term vision being used, but this has connotations of something seen in a dream, a trance, or something that's revelatory. And the source is either external or unreal. Whereas this very simple term, visual experience, this allows visual experience that is spontaneous or induced, but not actively constructed. And it encompasses also actively constructed visualization as well, which is, and usually real, externally sourced in the Buddhist context, visions. So I said to him that the term visual experience, he came up with it, but it so fits and is so simple, I feel like it's always been there. So I just thank you for making our writing about this subject a lot easier. I also said I would talk a little bit about why we need this conference and why this topic is so important. And I think it is a field that is changing rapidly at the moment, thanks in part to some of the people in this room and also some of the people online. So when we think of visual experience in Buddhist meditation, and if we look at books written until very recently on Buddhist meditation, there was a tendency to associate them with Mahayana and Tantra. So the beautiful image of the Buddhas appearing within the stupa from the Lotus Sutra that we see as we enter, multiple Buddhas from forms of Buddhanusmriti, found in early Buddhism, and the proliferation starts in the early canon, found in the Lotus Sutra. So various Mahayana sutras, or Pure Land visualization. This is actually a Maitreya, but you can see the Pure Land, if you look closely, by all the people popping out of lotuses around him from Dunhuan here. Or perhaps mandala construction and sadhana, or perhaps dream yoga and the use of the pervasion of emptiness between the dream state and the world to learn about and negotiate the world, including the world after death. Please do enjoy these slides and simple images, because I have a terrible habit of writing lots of lists in my slides, and I was challenged by Andrew Skilton to make my slides more simple, but they will disintegrate later into Abhidhamma lists. Okay. All right, so with early in Theravada, then there's been a tendency to think of the visual not as something in which one is immersed or which is a result of experience, but maybe as an object. So things like, I think the bar is cutting some of this. So things like the analysis of the 32 components of the body, the 10 asubha practices of body decomposing, which you see here from a Yoga-Bhattara manuscript, and the repulsiveness of food. So objects of our analysis, or resulting from the recollections, things like deities or the Buddha or kasana. So these visual devices made of colored discs or fire or space. So getting an object and from that generating a visual experience. I'm going to talk a little bit here about Nimitta. So Nimitta are the visual objects seen in meditation that are most associated in Theravada with kasana as active creation, but arise from some of the other meditations too. So mindfulness of breathing is one of the ones that is known to create these visions, these visual experiences, normally in the form of colored light. And in Buddhaghosa's Visuddhimagga, he defines them mainly in relation to kasana. And he talks about the preparatory sign where people, which is what the practitioner sees when he's relying on the external object, the acquiring sign when the practitioner is no longer so reliant on the external object, and then this purified sign, this purified essence of the meditation, the Patibhaga Nimitta. And it's this one is related to specific meditative attainments such as samadhi and jhana. And even in the Visuddhimagga, we see that the power to extend this level of nimitta is related to power over the area over which the meditator can extend it. Green has written in his book Before Chant, which I'll come to later, the counterpart sign is not the perfect eidetic visualization of the initial object of meditation, but rather something like the purified essence of the object. That's going to be important for me when I'm looking later at pre-modern Sri Lankan manuals. So you can remember that this third level of nimitta is a purified essence. Green refers to these kind of visions as confirmatory visions. And that's also going to be important for me later. There's been a tendency until recently to not mention or to sideline in modern Theravada-based discussions of Theravada meditation, both scholarly and modern practice, these nimitta. So seen more as side effects perhaps of meditation rather than something worth pursuing in their own right. And that, again, is very different in these pre-modern manuals. So I'll come back to that later. So this tendency then to see sort of the more immersive, didactic and other types of visual experience as Mahayana, and Theravada as being a bit more limited and focusing on vision as either way to introduce jhana or as an object of analysis. This is found in earlier scholarly works on meditation, and this is from Conze's 1956 famous book on meditation, still very useful today, and it has in it a section called A Note on Visions, and I'm going to read it in full because I like it so much. Okay, he writes, in addition to cultivating worship, the Mahayana also trained its adherents in visions of the Bodhisattvas and of the Buddhas and their paradises. These practices, which offered salvation at a cheap price, were, in their developed form, peculiar to Bhaktic Buddhism. He also goes on to say how you don't need to have any skill to produce these, so it's easy. It says they're already foreshadowed, though, in the scriptures of the Theravadins and in the commentary, so Dhammapada Atthakatha he uses. And he gives the example. So the Buddha appeared to a monk whose kammatthana, whose meditation exercise had become clear, and brushed the monk's face. So there's a physical interaction with these. And we're talking about visual experience because that is the thing that dominates, but often these experiences go with a physical experience as well. And then Conze writes, on the whole, the importance of all this is minimized in the wisdom traditions of the Theravada. So Theravada is presented as something that doesn't go in for these big visions. The Theravada, and that's always seems to be used to represent early Buddhism. Okay. And I would say that neurobiological studies have correspondingly lagged behind in this area. That is changing. So I noticed it's nearly 10 years ago now, this particular study, a phenomenology of meditation-induced light experiences, traditional Buddhist and neurobiological perspectives. So this is a study of people experiencing nimitta through their meditation, normally meditation and mindfulness of breathing. And I know this is beginning to change more, particularly in this very year, but because perhaps there aren't practitioners in the study, the designers of the study, the conclusion of this is a little bit limited. So it's about how these things are probably induced by sensory deprivation. So by being in a dark room or having your eyes closed or like that. Okay, so as I mentioned, this subject is changing very much at the moment. So complicating the picture, we have the text that we're going to be talking about tomorrow, the Yogavidya and Varsha from Kizil. This is an image of a meditator from it, which has some of the traditional meditation subjects we think about, like the components of the body, that kind of thing, but very graphic visual engagement with that. I don't know if these are snakes in this image. I think they may be, but the images involve things like knives, snakes. So it's a very, very interesting topic, and obviously complicates our ideas. So another recent book that complicates our understanding of visual experience in meditation is Daniel Stewart's work on the Siddhana Smriti of the Siddhana Sutra, which is so the meditation is very standard meditation, that it's analysis of the 6 bases of experience. So the elements that form are different, sight, hearing, that kind of basis of experience, but then goes on to use that as a basis for, so you meet with different gods and Buddhas as part of that. So when you reach the higher stages, the whole cosmos becomes involved in your transformation, and also uses narrative vision, which I'll also come back to later, narrative didactic vision. Eric Green's book, also really interesting. So Chan before Chan, so Chan the meditation before Chan the institution, as it were, the institution lineage. And in this, he looks at what's particularly interesting is the spontaneously arising visual experiences that teach doctrine. They're whole narratives, and they teach important sociological stages, things that the practitioner needs to realize. And then there are works then within Theravada as well that are changing the picture. And I thought I'd mention Lance Cousins and Sarah Shaw's recent work, Meditations of the Pali Tradition, which pick out the visual experiences that are already there in the canon that seem to foreshadow some of the later developments, including in some of the later texts, the visions of Buddhas, and the city of Nibbana as a vision, and also just the light and the appearance of the Buddha from different sources. So, and I think as people who are both practitioners and academics work on this field, we're beginning to see much more interesting work being developed. And this whole change in the tradition, in fact, so within the Mahayana side, certainly Indic Mahayana, there was a kind of move away from looking at the spiritual path and meditative experience and almost a rejection of it as a valid aspect of Indian Buddhist monastic life. So this is also a reaction to that, so swinging back to look at that kind of topic. I'm now going to start looking at pre-modern Theravadas, which I Kamatana, so meditation practice, which I refer to in my writing as Puran. It's the Pali word Purana as it's pronounced in Khmer Thai. And this is a term that was given to it in the modern period as new meditations developed, so from the early 20th century. And there's been the most important perhaps scholar on this has been François Bizot. Cover of his book is there. I'm just going to use these images to say a little bit about the general picture of the tradition. So the pre-modern Theravada, there are different transmission lineages, and they have some things in common, such as usually a ritual element. So the preparation for meditation involves certain rituals, usually, not always. And you can see there in the top left picture, Venerable Vera from Wat Rajasikaram doing an offering of sets of 5. And when I practice this in Cambodia, I have a similar altar that I'll use in my little kuti to do the same practice. And behind him, you can see somebody practicing meditation with a candle over a bowl in which little things are inserted, which will drop into the bowl as the candle burns down in times of meditation. And then the practitioner will then see as part of the meditation Nimitta, normally in the form of coloured light. And these are internalized in the body, and we've got the famous picture of Venerable Chandra-Saraswati of Wat there in the room for the balconies of the Jaguars out there, and on the top right of the screen. So internalizing it through bases into the body, where it's going to be brought down to the heart and a place near the navel, so and the area between those. And then, so just to the bottom right-hand image there is of a medical manual attributed to one of the last Ayutthaya period, I suppose, Sangaraja, and he this manual moves these qualities around in order to create healing. So it's used for healing as well. How these lights, these nimitta are induced varies according to tradition. So Venerable Chandra-Saraswati, he taught people to actively create them. And I know that I think Pibben's going to be talking about the background to that in his talk later today. In the case of Venerable Vera, who you see at the top there, he get people to sit, use a breathing exercise with a visual, an auditory, some kind of mantra like Araham as they're breathing, and then the meditator reports what they see. In the Cambodian tradition I've been working in, you do the same, but you have a question. You have a question you're seeking the answer to, and that question is not obvious. So it's like a puzzle, and you don't necessarily know the meaning of the word, but then you report on the answer. And so it takes you through stages. So Cambodia, most of these traditions lost in the center during reforms under the Thai Kamayut and under the French inspired Pali studies, but and then in rural areas during the Pol Pot period, but there are lineages that continue. And although they're scarce, some of them are quite important culturally. So the monk you see pictured here, he's at a temple that's very important for the military and the government. And so the meditation practices done by the monk and his followers they are regarded as also giving protective power. And that's why these are important for politicians and military as well. So he's important both for Thai politicians and for Cambodian politicians. Right, so going into the types of visual experience, sorry, I can't see the title, but I'm going to talk about the types of nimitta you get. So first of all, you've got the various terms for them: nimitta, lakkhana, characteristics, rasmi, rays of light, and just dhamma, and also various local terms for crystal, sphere. And you've got the three types of nimitta we came across before from Buddhaghosa, so the preliminary sign, and I've just quoted here one of the Sri Lankan manuals on the nimitta you see when you're practicing loving kindness, practicing metta. The preliminary sign is like a firefly, the acquiring sign is like the feathers of a peacock's tail, and the counterpart sign has the colour of a kalabana stone. Such are the distinguishing marks of metta. So single spheres of light, or perhaps imagery of colour, sometimes scintillating rather than just still. Sometimes Buddhas within. Sometimes the nimitta are in forms of narrative, and this is quite important for learning certain things or receiving kind of messages. I'll come back to, and symbols. So city of Nibbana, or the tree of the Dharma, tree of the body. And then also you might have nimitta which involve visiting other realms, particularly the loving kindness ones, and meeting other beings. So the meeting other beings is quite important again in the cultural use of this in Cambodia. So what are the functions? How are these used? So in the Cambodian tradition, so what I'm talking about now often comes from the practice traditions, which are Thailand and Cambodia, and I'll explain why in a minute. But in the Cambodian tradition, you use these visual experiences in the early stages to establish a secure framework within which to progress. And that's partly by the way that groups of threes, for example, represent, groups of threes and fives represent certain aspects of one's life. So it might include the representation of parents. So even if you have a difficult relationship with your parents, or the parents have died, here you can set up a solid relationship with them, and it kind of creates this social, safe social framework within which to practice. Then it's used for prognostication. So what people might see coming up to death, perhaps, will tell where they're going next. And that's very similar to some Tibetan texts. And then it can in part confirm important sociological teachings. So I mentioned these questions you get, and you don't know what the question even means, but then you get this response. So you might have a question which you don't know is asking you actually to do an asubha practice, the decomposition of the body, and you might suddenly find yourself very minute, walking in a sort of horizontal skeleton, and the whole, like a cathedral, which is your skeleton, something like that. Or you might have an experience of a previous birth, and so learn about rebirth or this kind of thing. These nimitta are used to engage with dying and recently deceased beings and beings in from other realms. And so this idea, and this is important culturally in Cambodia because there's one monk who used to attend, well, still attends funerals, but may not have meditation experience now, attending the funerals in order to help guide the person who is deceased into their next life. And the high-level teachers are used also to maybe help people in their practice, so enter that person's meditation and bring them back if they've got too engrossed or something like that. Then the next one there, diagnostic of meditative attainment. So this is the usual practice, and Cambodian teachers will have a little manual of which nimitta relates to which attainment, so they can remember when they're sort of the teacher for lots of people on a retreat, who's doing what, don't get confused, and they can just check, oh yes, now you've attained that, you need to go on to that one. And the last thing which I want to focus on is they're used to progressively incorporate into the body beautiful mental states, so the Sobhana, Chitta and Cetasika Abhidhamma. And that last one is what we see in the Sri Lankan manual. So the Sri Lankan manuals don't tell us much about how to start the practice. So when I first was looking at these manuals, of which we have a number in the British Library, I could not understand how this practice worked at all. Just a little bit of background of these manuals. They came from Ayutthaya in the mid-18th century, when Buddhism in Sri Lanka was in crisis. And so there was a request to Ayutthaya to restart the ordination lineage in Sri Lanka. And it was partly also a plot to get a Thai prince on the throne in Sri Lanka. As part of it, there were 3 missions that came from Ayutthaya at this time, and the middle one brought 2 meditation masters. And King Kirti Sri Rajasingha sponsored the renovation of cave temples in Sri Lanka for local monks to learn meditation from these Siamese monks and then practice. And here's an example of them, one of these cave temples. And this is what so they didn't write, so these monks wrote in Sinhala or Pali Sinhala mix. Very in-depth manuals. They didn't say anything about how to start, how to initially get the Nimitta. Obviously, that was something that was straightforward, but they did record in great detail what you do with the Nimitta once you got them. And so this text is about 4,000 verses long, and each verse may contain about 20 different instructions in an abridged form. Actually, it's in a kind of code, not the code is created by abridgment. So, and actually, this image here on the screen, for those who are in the room, is a version of this Dhammakai image that we've got on the screen behind me. In that, you are looking, you've got a bird's eye view of the body, and the circles are the nimitta that are being brought down into the body at the navel. So it's these manuals then that I want to talk about. Okay. I warned you I had these slides that are long lists because it's quite hard to remember all the content of these. So an overview of, I can't read the title myself. So the overview of this, first of all, pre-modern range of practices that we have in Theravada. So it's the longest traceable set of lineages of Theravada meditation, and the date has been set actually by Pupil who's going to be talking to us later. And they involve the distinctive movement and incorporation of initially nimitta at the lower stages, so something visual, but later unimitta experience. So somehow they are used to capture the meditative experience and bring it in the body, and later you don't need something visual. It reflects Abhidhamma, and the terminology that's used in these texts is the Abhidhamma that developed between the canonical period and the 5th century. So we see later vocabulary changes in Abhidhamma that are not present in this. When I say 5th century, so I'm thinking of things like the Hadayawatu, that's something we find in the commentaries and not in the canon, even though people say it's implicit in the canon. One feature of these meditations is that they are progressive, not iterative. I remember reading in a fairly recent publication on meditations across cultures that one thing about meditation is that it's iterative, but actually this is progressing through multiple stages. And what these advanced texts show us is that they break down the attainments of meditation and of the spiritual path into the Dhamma of Abhidhamma, and I will talk a little bit about the 5 piti, which the 5 joys which start the practice. I've written a lot elsewhere about how these practices reflect other technologies of change. So these practices are about bringing about change in the practitioner. And I won't go into it, but I just want to mention that we see parallels with the way the Nimitta are brought into the body with medicine, particularly the delivery pathways for treating the embryo in the womb. Embryonic development is a model of developing the Buddha within, or the Dhammakaya within, is really important. There are aspects of chemistry, so the purification of mercury and gold, which we also see in mainland Indian tantric practices, so the chemistry is important there. Substitution, replacing the thing you want to get rid of with the thing you're aiming for, which is a foundational technology for other sciences, such as traditional grammar, medicine, and also Abhidhamma. And the potency of language to represent and transmit between consciousness and materiality is also very important. And finally, group theory mathematics, which you're going to be very glad I'm not going to go into here. Okay. So going back to the Sri Lankan manuals, when we look at them and we can compare them with the Visuddhimagga, which is also an Abhidhamma-based manual, we see that the Sri Lankan meditation manuals are actually very similar in content. So they have the same, so this is just on the basis of the Samadhi section of the Visuddhimagga. But the Quran texts do also go into the Vipassana sections as well, the Prajna section, sorry. And basically they have the same overlap, and then but broken down, if you can see the top three on the right-hand side there, into the individual aspects of the results of meditation. And I'll look at that in a little bit more detail. But first I need to talk a bit about Abhidhamma for us to understand this. So Abhidhamma, the main purpose to understand, explain causality, especially how to understand progress on the Buddhist path to Nibbana. And it expands on the three fundamental characteristics of all phenomena: dukkha, suffering, anicca, impermanence. And anatta, suddenly with retroflex, do apologize. No self, but now they've got that. Okay. And it's about impermanence, but also permanence needs change. So loss and decay, but also development and hope, so positive change. And I would say that here in this context, Abhidhamma is the guide to positive change. So Abhidhamma analyzes all experiences into Dhamma, individual factors of reality, and how they interrelate. And typically there's these four types, so materiality, citta, moments of consciousness, and cetasika, aspects of consciousness, and nibbana. Now, every citta, every conscious experience co-arises with multiple cetasika, giving us our experience of life. And in the material world, they also interact with rupa, with materiality. So the cetasika, which form the citta of the early stages of meditation in this type of practice, are represented by nimitta, or be either represented by nimitta or occur because of, the nimitta represent or occur because of the citta and cetasika we're experiencing. And so I showed that we have this breaking down of the practice into smaller phases. And the first stage we have is the 5 piti. These are the joys that arise in early stages of jhana. So the increasingly elevated focused state of mind and body and mind that result from peaceful and successful meditation practice. And here they're broken down and they're not treated as successive, but they're represented by nimitta that are then brought into the body and combined in the body. In the second stage, we see the yugala, 6 pairs, positive attributes of body and mind, such as calm, lightness, pliancy, etc. These are antidotes to the 5 hindrances. and other kilesa that prevent successful meditation and progress on the path. So the manuals, the Sri Lankan manuals, break the practice down into these minute levels, and each one is represented by a nimitta, which is then incorporated into the body in combination with others. So how does this type of meditation relate to Abhidhamma? So we've got Abhidhamma breaks down experience into components, how they're causally related and how to bring about positive change. And as ordinary people, our mental states may be unskillful, based in greed, hate, and delusion, or skillful. And on the Buddhist path, we're aiming to discard the unskillful states. And as we leave them behind, our mental states may be kusala, vipaka, and kiriya functional as we get to the higher levels. So these are the sobhana, beautiful mental states. And what Vajrayana meditation does is it breaks down this Abhidhamma path into the citta-cetasika, the small component, the attributes of consciousness that have to coexist with consciousness, and takes the practitioner through them step by step from Kutujana to enlightened, and does so using these nimitta. In the early stages, I mentioned that citta-cetasika and citta have nimitta, our stages do not. And for our practice, breaking them down, bring them into the body, and the last bullet point there. And in Sri Lanka, this method culminates in the Sri Lanka manuals in the 9 supramundane states, but broken all the way down into these citta-cetasika. Why bring the citta-cetasika into the body? So this is partly about the interdependence between Rupa, Chitta, and Citta-cetasika, coexistence. But also, it's obviously about the principle that materiality can be caused by consciousness. So bringing meditation experiences into the body changes the body. Incorporation is initially at the heart base and navel, but then changes place according to which practice it is. So the meditation is somatic and is aiming for the change of physicality of the practitioner. Now, this parallels understandings of the Buddha's body as physically constructed by his perfections, qualities, and Dharma found elsewhere. And this is also a subject that is changing at the moment. The idea that the Buddha is one whose body is adorned by the 37 factors of awakening, the idea that the Buddha consists of Dharma, Dharma being understood in different ways, the 32 mark of a great man as a result of the perfections in Boucher's work, and the Buddha as an instantiation of Dharma in Sean's work. So this is another developing field, which I think needs to be used in conjunction with this to understand fully what's happening in there. And I will just leave with a slide of the recent scholarship that has contributed to the development of looking specifically at pre-modern Theravada meditation. Thank you.
Would you like to take a question?
Yes.
Thank you, Kate, for a wonderful talk, and I apologise for my delay. I obviously needed a good manual of Cambridge. I found it wonderfully interesting to see this great richness of practice, and I wondered how much of it had been disseminated into popular consumption, in the sense of the printing press and publications, or was it primarily esoteric?
Thank you. So the monks from Ayutthaya in the mid-18th century, they one of them produced a narrative manual for the Queen of Kandy. So, and that doesn't contain meditation, it contains narratives about understanding Buddha's teachings, but these are very closely related to visions one might have in meditation. So in that sense, some of it's for popular consumption, But in Cambodia, one of the reasons it disappeared is that the traditionalists thought that this should not be put, it should not be published. It should only be taught in a closed teacher-pupil relationship after appropriate initiations. And I think this is also one of the reasons why now, after the Pol Pot period in Cambodia, it will disappear, because there was an initial resurgence after the Vietnamese re-allowed ordination, and people could start going to the, so when this is done, it's done by lay people as well as monks and nuns. For lay people, the 2 periods of the year will be after one of the rice harvests, where people go to the temple for 9 days, and they're a separate part of a lot of Cambodian temples with these huts for lay practitioners, or done during the during the rains retreat period, but always with appropriate initiation. And now, whereas with the reinstatement of Buddhism, things like Vipassana classes are advertised, whereas this, your karma has to lead you to a teacher. And so I have not been able to persuade teachers to advertise, and the first teachers I was working with have died, so they were very elderly. So it's, I think, only with so the popularization and making it exoteric by Chandasoro Sot and others is really where we can see it publicly, certainly at the lower levels. Another way it informs culture is through things like tattoo. So traditionally, to do the tattooing, you needed to have expertise in this meditation. So those famous, actually, I think we're going to talk about yantras and yours, aren't we, as well? I'll leave that to you. So, but yeah, yantras needed to be informed by knowledge of the types, the way that you can replace things through these practices.
So it is still alive as a tradition.
I think it's changed. Yeah. So I don't think I find what the Sri Lankan manuals, that in-depth practice, I haven't found somebody practicing that. And that's quite difficult, because it will be really interesting to understand how particularly the advanced levels are understood to work, where you're not bringing in the Nimitta in, you're bringing an experience without Nimitta into the body. So I feel a bit like a fish out of water when I'm trying to understand how that might work.
Yes. Thank you. Are there any? Yes.
Yes, just thank you very much for your very informative and very thought-provoking presentation. So second, my question very succinctly relates to the crisscrossing relation, the meditation of samatha and vipassana in Sri Lankan manuals. In my world, according to the Visuddhi Marga, the path of purification, samatha directly refers to the objective visual experience, what you talk about nimitta, like the book says, kama chanda dipachanike dhamme samipiti, samatha, 5 obstacles to nirvana: desire, hatred, sloth, and torpor, restless, and worry, and a skeptical doubt. That's all right. It is very objective visual experience. On the other side, I would say the meditation vipassana, as it says, anicca divasena vividehi akare passati vipassana, to envisage the nature of ephemeral world, the suffering and impermanence and the absence of self. It is a very subjective visual experience. So my question, do you think in Sri Lankan manuals, there is a very intermingled relation between samatha and vipassana, the subjectivity and objectivity towards realizing the ultimate reality in the world?
I think to answer that, I think I have to combine living practice in Cambodia with the Sri Lankan manuals. I can't get a complete picture from the one. So I would say that some of the Nimitta give, even at quite early stages, give one a progressive understanding of the types of thing we associate with Vipassana. In the Sri Lankan manuals, those experiences, the actual content of that insight isn't described in the way that it might be described in the third section of the Sutta. But those experiences of Vipassana and also the Pala, those are also incorporated into the body. So this treatment is very distinctive, and that it's covering the whole path. So right from Puthujjana up to Arahat is all included in this process. Does that answer the question?
Yes, absolutely, this makes sense.
Thank you very much for your wonderful talk. You mentioned how in these traditions the meditator will internalize the Nimitta, and it's striking that in the Tibetan Dzogchen tradition by Chogai, we have in a sense the opposite movement. The idea is that the visions manifest from the heart through the pathways of the eyes outwardly in space, starting off as tingling or bindus and then growing into more complex visions. So I find this very interesting that we have, on the one hand, an internalization process, and on the other hand,
there are sections where you do get to do those journeys, and you do get bindus starting and then creating Buddhas and that kind of thing. So it has some of those aspects too. I suppose I was focusing mainly on the incorporation, but then you do get to travel and go out and see the cosmos and meet the different gods and that kind of thing as well. I think when people first started looking at this material, they did wonder about a Tibetan influence. I wonder if there's more a kind of medical and Abhidhamma background in both that are informing this, but jury's out on that, I guess.
Thank you, actually. And we have online Kathy Cantwell. So I think she has a question for us. Hello, Kathy.
Hello. Can you all hear me?
Loud and clear.
Yes.
Yeah, great. Okay, so it's wonderful talk. Thank you so much, Kate. You know, really, really exciting, really lovely to see this material coming out. And to be able to look now at these kinds of comparisons with the sort of Tibetan material that Dylan and I are working on, and your thing. I was actually in a way a similar sort of question to Dylan's in terms of direction. You spoke about, you know, sort of going from, if you like, the mental generation or mental vision or whatever, then into sort of incorporating into the body. I was wondering about the other way round. In Tibetan tradition, one thing which is done, and this is especially the case in, if you like, public events or incorporating, you get these great meditation masters who then lead practice sessions. They actually do all the meditations and so on, but publicly. But there's also a sort of outer ritualization, if you like. You get the three-dimensional mandala constructions, you get all the sort of implements, you know, there might be a practice in which you're sort of, everyone gets dressed up in effect as the deity, with all the sort of features of the deity then being put on the parts of the body and so on, so that it's actually, we're getting here, you know, you're sort of almost starting with the body. And some of the manuals say things like, you know, without even meditation, you know, we can see this, everything is here, you know. I wondered, and you mentioned initiation, because of course we get this kind of thing, of course, in Tibetan initiations, where I mean, obviously the master has to do the meditation, all the visualizations and so on, but the students need to sit there receptively, and all their senses are, as it were, part of it, and they see and they hear and everything, and this actually brings the whole experience to life. And I wondered, with the initiations that you mentioned, whether they have some aspect of this, or whether you've come across this kind of movement in your manuals.
Not in that detail and not as visible. The initiations do that thing. You have a tantra ritual of the master taking on the Papapama and and passing the merit over, things like that, and the kind of, and inviting the experiences to come about. So they're quite focused, those initiations are quite focused. On the other hand, like you said, the master is then leads other things. So we've already mentioned things like tattooing and yantras, but also funerals, so they can guide the deceased. But there's also other rituals like a kind of rebirthing ritual, which is done in the center of a kind of maze, which represents the journey to Mount Meru. And so those exist. When Olivier de Benon was interviewing people after the Pol Pot period who were old, sort of elderly teachers at the time, they reflected back on some very physical practices. I mean, he opens his 2000 PhD thesis with using I think it's a mortar and pestle as very physical activities. So there obviously was a whole physical aspect to this that was acted and not just incorporated. But I haven't myself got evidence for that. So I'm just relying on the field work done by Olivier de Benon and François to understand those things. Although that thing about rebirthing, my first day of field work in 2012, the first thing I came across, I just happened to go along and I saw one of those rebirthing rituals, so joined in, and that tends to be done by older people in part as a longevity practice.
Thank you. Oh, yes, we must, it's so important. We must have one or two more questions, if that's all right. Yeah.
Thank you.
Who is first?
Yes.
Could we have a quick question? Very quick. Yeah.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Crosby. And my question is on the manuals actually. What manuals are you referring here as Sri Lankan manuals in pre-modern period? We have at least 2 from Bambaragali
Yes.
Temple and Hangurankita. Are you referring these 2 or one?
So there are a number scattered around Sri Lanka.
Yeah.
There's one in the Museum in Colombo. There are then the ones that were copied. Then there are 11 manuscripts containing 17 texts in the British Library that were collected by Hugh Neville. And at the time that he was collecting, the Siam Nikaya had basically stopped doing this practice. And so he was able to get those texts and I think asked to copy another text in return. So that's, I think, why there are so many. So those are from different temples connected with the Siam Nikaya. With the later Nikayas, they brought in different type of meditation from Burma.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. A really nice talk. I have a really simple question. I don't know if you'll be able to help. You mentioned the Kalunga stone.
Yes.
Okay. It's not a name that I recognize. Can you tell me another name for this stone?
I'm very disappointed you don't recognize it because I do not know what it is. So if anybody does,
That's okay.
and I looked it up because
it
there was
sounds like a barrel. Maybe.
there are lots. I mean, there are lots of barrels.
Is
in
it
Sri Lanka.
cat's eye, a kind of cat's eye type colour? I think it might be, but I don't know.
Don't know. So
Yeah,
if anyone knows,
yeah.
and I don't think it's in that recent. There's that lovely recent book on gems in South Asia or something in it. But it doesn't. So yes,
It's just the
Answers on Facebook.
name. I
Yeah.
don't recognize.
I've looked.
It's all right. Don't
Thank you
worry.
very
Well, thank you, Kate, and I would just like to say, what I wanted to say very quickly is that the work that Kate and the people working with her are doing is transforming global understandings of Theravada Buddhism. And this is really important scholarship that you're conducting. And we're very lucky to have you here and to have these talks. Thank you.